August 4th, 1962. Brentwood, California. A woman spent the day in her own home. Her first home, the first place she had ever owned outright, chosen by herself, being decorated by herself, slowly and carefully filled with the specific things that Norma Jean wanted around her, rather than the things that Marilyn Monroe was supposed to have. Mexican furniture, simple textiles, a garden she was learning to tend, a house that was, for the first time in 36 years of living in other people's spaces, entirely and unconditionally hers. She made phone calls during the day. She spoke to her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, who visited her in the afternoon. She spoke to her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, who was present throughout. She spoke to her half-sister, Bernice, to whom she said she felt fine. She spoke to her friend and former actor Peter Lawford, who later said she had sounded strange, her voice slow and thickened in the way it got when the medication was heavy in her system. She did not speak to Joe DiMaggio. He had been planning to visit the following week. They had been spending time together again in recent months, quietly, without announcement, the relationship that had never fully ended, resuming its particular form of presence in each other's lives. He was going to come on Tuesday. She was looking forward to it. She told people so. She was found by her housekeeper at approximately 3 in the morning on August 5th. She was lying on her bed. The telephone was in her hand. Empty prescription bottles were on the nightstand. She was 36 years old. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled her death a probable suicide by acute barbiturate poisoning. The word probable has carried enormous weight in the decades since. It was the coroner's honest acknowledgement that the evidence, while consistent with suicide, was not conclusive, that the circumstances of her death contained enough ambiguity that certainty was not available. 70 years later, certainty is still not available. The questions remain, but underneath all of them, underneath the theories and the investigations and the decades of speculation, is the one question that matters more than any of them. What was lost when Norma Jean Mortensen died in that house in Brentwood at 36 years old? What did the world lose? What did the generation that had loved her lose? And what does it mean that the flowers on her grave have never stopped coming? This is the last episode. This is where we try to answer that. The summer of 1962 was not from the inside a summer of ending. It was a summer of fighting back. Marilyn Monroe had been fired by Fox in June. She had absorbed the humiliation with the same composure she brought to every public wound, showing none of it outwardly, processing it privately, and then almost immediately beginning the work of responding to it on her own terms. The photo shoot with Lawrence Schiller that produced the extraordinary final images had been part of that response, a deliberate, controlled demonstration that the woman Fox had publicly declared finished was not finished and had no intention of becoming so. The interviews she gave that summer reinforced the same message. She spoke to Life magazine, to Vogue, to several other publications. Long, substantive conversations in which she discussed her work with genuine intelligence and genuine passion, her future projects with real conviction, her sense of herself and her career with the kind of clear-eyed self-awareness that had always characterized her private journals and that she allowed that summer to surface more fully in public than she usually did. She talked about wanting to play the lead in a Dostoevsky adaptation. The brothers Karamazov had interested her for years. She talked about returning to the stage. She talked about the kind of work she still wanted to do, the range she had not yet been given the opportunity to fully demonstrate, the decade of serious, dramatic roles she was planning and intending and fully committed to pursuing. The people who interviewed her that summer said afterward, consistently, that she had seemed more herself than they had seen her in years. More grounded, more present, more like a woman who had come through something difficult and was standing on the other side of it with a clearer sense of who she was and what she wanted. She was also, that summer, quietly rebuilding her relationship with Joe DiMaggio. They had been seeing each other with increasing regularity since the hospitalization, meeting for dinners, spending time together in the uncomplicated way that the years of shared history and genuine mutual affection made possible. There had been conversations about remarrying. Neither of them confirmed this publicly. People who knew them both said the conversations were real. DiMaggio had asked her. She had not yet said yes. She was thinking about it. She was, for the first time in a long time, allowing herself to imagine a future that looked different from the immediate past. Quieter, more personal, less defined by the demands of the image, and more defined by the needs of Norma Jean. She was making plans. That is the most important thing to hold on to about the summer of 1962. She was making plans. But before the summer ended, there was one final image, one last moment in which Marilyn Monroe stepped fully into the light and produced something so concentrated and so completely herself that it became, in retrospect, the perfect final statement of everything she had been. May 19th, 1962. Madison Square Garden, New York City, President John F. Kennedy's 45th birthday celebration, a massive Democratic fundraiser attended by 15,000 people, one of the most glamorous political events of the decade. Marilyn Monroe had been asked to sing Happy Birthday to the president. She had agreed months earlier over the objections of Fox, which was still trying to salvage Something's Got to Give and did not want her absent from the production for even a single day. She wore a dress that Jean-Louis had designed specifically for her, flesh-colored, covered in 2,500 hand-sewn rhinestones, so fitted to her body that she had to be sewn into it. It was not a dress that could be worn by anyone else or in any other context. It was designed for exactly one purpose: to make Marilyn Monroe, standing on a stage in Madison Square Garden in front of 15,000 people, the most visible and the most undeniable thing in the room. She walked to the microphone. The master of ceremonies, Peter Lawford, had introduced her 3 times already. She had been backstage, unable to make herself move, the anxiety doing what anxiety does. And then she walked out, and the 15,000 people in the garden made a sound that witnesses described afterward as something between a roar and a sigh, the specific collective sound of a crowd encountering something at the absolute peak of its power. She sang, slowly, breathlessly, in that voice that she had constructed 20 years earlier to control a stutter, and that had become, over those 20 years, the most recognizable female voice in the world. She sang Happy Birthday to the President of the United States as though it were a love song, which in some sense that made everyone in the room simultaneously delighted and uncomfortable. It was. Kennedy, watching from his seat, smiled the specific smile of a man who understood exactly what was happening and was enjoying every second of it. He came to the microphone afterward and said that after a serenade like that, he could retire from politics. The audience laughed. The cameras captured everything. The photographs from that night are the last truly iconic images of Marilyn Monroe. The dress, the microphone, the 15,000 people and the president, and the specific electricity of a woman who was more completely herself in that moment than in almost any moment that had been captured before or since. She was 35 years old. She had 11 weeks left to live. The questions that surround August 4th, 1962 have been investigated, analyzed, theorized about, and argued over for 60 years without producing the certainty that the people who loved her have always wanted and deserved. What is known is this: the day was ordinary in most of its visible dimensions. She woke in her Brentwood home. She made calls. Dr. Greenson visited in the afternoon and stayed for several hours, longer than a routine visit, a fact that various investigators have noted and interpreted in various ways. Eunice Murray, her housekeeper, was present throughout the day and into the evening. Peter Lawford called and found her sounding strange. He called again and got no answer. At some point during the night, Marilyn Monroe took a fatal quantity of barbiturates. The precise circumstances, whether deliberately, accidentally, or through some combination of the chronic overmedication that had been building for years, are not established with certainty and have never been established with certainty despite decades of investigation. The Kennedy connection, the nature of the relationship, its ending, the role that the withdrawal of that relationship may have played in her state of mind in the weeks before her death has been the subject of enormous speculation. What can be said honestly is that she had been close to the Kennedy circle, that the relationship had ended or was ending in a way that added to her isolation, and that the summer of 1962 contained personal losses alongside the professional ones that compounded the fragility of a woman who was already carrying more than she could sustain. At approximately 3 in the morning on August 5th, Eunice Murray became concerned and called Dr. Greenson. He arrived and found Marilyn Monroe dead in her bedroom. The telephone was in her hand, the prescription bottles were empty. She was 36 years old. The coroner's report said probable suicide. The probable has never been resolved. The questions have never been answered. The investigations have never produced certainty. What is certain is simpler and more devastating than any theory. She was 36 years old. She had been planning a future. She had been making phone calls to people she loved. She had been thinking about remarrying the man who had never stopped sending her roses. And she was gone. Joe DiMaggio was in San Francisco when he heard the news. He had been scheduled to visit the following Tuesday. He had been looking forward to it. He had, by every account of the people close to him, been happier in recent months than he had been in years. The cautious, patient, never quite extinguished hope that he had carried since the divorce finally seeming, after 8 years, to be pointing toward something real. He flew to Los Angeles immediately. He took charge of the funeral arrangements with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything, quietly, without drama, doing what needed to be done. He selected the cemetery, Westwood Village Memorial Park, close to the home she had loved. He chose the flowers, white roses and garden vines placed throughout the chapel. He wrote the guest list personally, and he barred, deliberately and explicitly, the Hollywood establishment from attending. The people who had used her, the people who had made their careers and their fortunes from her image and her talent and her willingness to keep working under conditions that would have stopped most people. The directors who had complained about her publicly while privately acknowledging her genius. The executives who had fired her while destroying extraordinary footage. The industry that had taken everything she had to give and called her difficult for the cost of giving it. None of them were permitted through the door. Only people who had genuinely loved her. Only people who had seen Norma Jean and not only Marilyn. He then arranged for roses to be delivered to her grave 3 times a week. He did this for 20 years, quietly, without announcement, without any expectation of recognition or credit. Simply the roses, 3 times a week, for 20 years. Until his own death in 1999. He never remarried. At her graveside service, he leaned down and said quietly, "I love you, I love you, I love you," 3 times. The question of Marilyn Monroe's legacy has been answered in many ways over the 60 years since her death. Through the image, through the merchandise, through the academic studies and the biographies and the films and the theatrical productions and the endless reproduction of that face on posters and t-shirts and coffee mugs in every country on earth. But the real legacy is quieter than any of that. And it belongs specifically to the generation watching this video, the people who were young adults in 1962 and who received the news of her death the way you received news that takes something from the world that the world needed and was not finished with. What was lost was not primarily the image. The image survived. The image is, if anything, more present now than it was when she was alive. More reproduced, more referenced, more universally recognized. The image did not need Marilyn Monroe to continue existing. It was already larger than her and would outlast her indefinitely. What was lost was Norma Jean, the woman who read Dostoevsky at 2 in the morning and wrote poetry in notebooks she showed almost no one, and wanted children, and was frightened most of the time and funny in the specific, warm, completely unperformed way that the people who actually knew her described as one of the most distinctive things about her. The woman who had survived foster care and poverty and the studio system and 2 broken marriages and a hospitalization and a public firing, and had come out the other side of all of it still planning, still reaching, still insisting she was not finished. That woman was 36 years old. She had, by any honest measure, decades of extraordinary work still ahead of her. The roles she would have played, the performances she would have given, the evolution of an artist who had already demonstrated in 3 decades of sustained and largely under-recognized work that she was capable of things the industry that employed her had never adequately allowed her to show. all of it gone. On the night of August 4th, in a house in Brentwood, in her own bed, in her own home, the first home she had ever owned. The flowers on her grave have never stopped coming, not on anniversaries, not on birthdays, every day, for 60 years. Left by people who understand, in ways that cultural analysis cannot fully capture, that what was lost in that house in Brentwood was not a movie star. It was a human being, extraordinary and ordinary and frightened and brave and brilliant and broken and reaching, always reaching for the thing she had been looking for since she was 7 years old and her mother was taken away. She never found it, but she never stopped looking, and the world has never stopped knowing that it failed her. Think about the specific cruelty of the timing. She was 36 years old, in the context of a serious artistic career, a career built on the kind of interior work, the emotional depth, the hard-won self-knowledge that only accumulates with time and experience. 36 is not the end. It is closer to the beginning of the most important part. Marlon Brando at 36 had not yet made The Godfather. Paul Newman at 36 had not yet made Cool Hand Luke. The actors she was compared to, the artists she was ranked alongside by the people who saw her work clearly, did their defining work in their 40s and 50s and beyond, in the decade or two after the rawness of youth had been tempered by experience into something more controlled and more complete. Marilyn Monroe never got those years. She never got the film that would have shown, once and for all and beyond any argument, what she was fully capable of. She never got the role that would have been written specifically for the woman she had become by 1962. Not the dumb blonde, not the comic goddess, not even the serious actress of Bus Stop and the Misfits, but something beyond all of those. Something that used the full range of everything she had accumulated across 36 years of living harder and more honestly than almost anyone around her. Lee Strasberg believed that role existed. He said so. He said that what Marilyn Monroe could have done with the right material in the right conditions, with the creative autonomy she had been fighting for her entire career, what she could have done was beyond what any of them had yet seen from her. And they had seen things that stopped rooms full of serious people cold. She believed it too. That is the most important thing. She was not giving up in the summer of 1962. She was not winding down or accepting defeat or making peace with a diminished future. She was planning, actively, specifically, with the same focused intelligence she had brought to every phase of her career. The Dostoevsky adaptation, the return to the stage. The next decade of work that was going to be different from everything that had come before because she was different, older, harder to fool, clearer about what she needed and less willing to accept less than that. The world lost all of it on August 4th. Every film she would have made, every performance she would have given, every interview in which she would have said something that stopped the person across the table and made them understand finally that they had been looking at her wrong for years. It lost Norma Jean's future, and that loss has no adequate accounting. This has been the Marilyn Monroe series, 7 episodes, 1 life, 36 years that produced the most famous face in the world and one of the most extraordinary and heartbreaking stories in American history. Norma Jean Mortensen, born June 1st, 1926, Los Angeles, California, died August 4th, 1962. Brentwood, California, age 36. 3 films that will outlast every person who doubted her. 430 books, every one read. Journals full of poetry she wrote for no one. A company she built from nothing. Contracts she fought for and won. Performances that the greatest directors of her era were eventually forced to call what they were: extraordinary. And a grave in Westwood that has never gone a single day without flowers. Not in 60 years. Not once. The generation watching this video was there. You received the news on August 5th, 1962, the way you receive news that takes something irreplaceable. You have carried her since, not the image. You were never fooled by just the image. You carried Norma Jean, the real one. The one who was worth carrying. She knew she was worth it. She always knew. She spent her entire life trying to make the world know it too. The world knows it now. 60 years too late and not enough, but it knows. This has been Legends of America. I don't want to make money. I just want to be wonderful. Marilyn Monroe.